1934, the world depression reaches new depths, and the sacrifice of the soldiers of the Great War is fast fading from memory. In August, 80,000 veterans, many unemployed, and most feeling betrayed by the world they fought to preserve, gather in Toronto, determined to remind the world of their service and to rekindle the flame of brotherhood. The veterans reaffirm their allegiance to King and Empire. We, the Canadian Corps, in reunion assembled, solemnly reaffirm our loyalty and allegiance to our God, to our King, to our country. Speaking for the veterans, Canon Scott evokes the ideals of the Canadian Corps and the desolate world of the Great Depression.
It was not mere blind patriotism that inspired the men of the Canadian Corps, but the world appeal to uphold justice and liberty and the brotherhood of man. Alas, my comrades, what has happened since? In the world at large, unemployment, poverty, and even starvation. Where is the world that we fought to establish?
1 month after the Toronto rally, other veterans celebrate their success, more than a year in power of one of their own, Adolf Hitler, the leader of Germany.
Vor uns liegt Deutschland, in uns marschiert Deutschland und hinter uns kommt Deutschland.
As Adolf Hitler triumphs in Germany, Canadians squabble over the cost of building memorials to their Great War veterans and even to their greatest victories. It was on Easter Monday, April the 9th, 1917, that the entire Canadian Corps attacked Vimy Ridge. Vimy Ridge was one of Canada's greatest victories, and as it turned out, one of the crucial battles of the First World War. And it was on Vimy Ridge that the government decided to build the Canadian National Memorial in honor of all the Canadian dead of the Great War.
After the war, a committee got together, including Sir Arthur Currie, and they decided on which Canadian battlefields were going to be commemorated. They felt that Vimy was one of the great victories for sure. It wasn't necessarily the biggest, but it was the best place for Canada's national monument, and that's why the monument's here. To build the monument, they had to clear the old First World War battlefield and build a road system to bring up all the stone, which came from Yugoslavia. So they had to construct this massive road. Of course, there's dugouts and there's literally thousands of shells and, you know, all sorts of stuff. This was a dangerous place after the war. So they had to do that first, and then they started to build the bastion here.
Towering over the highest point of Vimy, the twin pylon design of Toronto artist Walter Allward takes 14 years to build, requires 15,000 tons of concrete, and 6,000 tons of white limestone transported from Yugoslavia. Walter Allward personally oversees all phases of the construction.
They didn't carve any of the statues and bring them in. They carved them here, and that's what's really remarkable. And when you look up the two pylons, at the very top, they had to build little studios in situ so that the sculptors could come up and carve them directly into the stone, because they're carved out of one piece. So they had all these studios up there. They had an elevator to take the sculptors up there, and they worked from plaster casts of Walter Allward's work. The original statues are half size, and they're plaster, and you can still see them today in Ottawa, where they have the caliper marks, where the sculptors working on them were doing their measurements.
After 14 years of controversy and mounting costs, the Vimy Monument is ready for unveiling in 1936. More than 6,000 Vimy pilgrims board specially chartered steamships and sail for France. And on July 26, 1936, more than 100,000 people gather at Vimy for the opening of the memorial to the battle that had taken place almost 20 years before.
One of the men on the tour was my grandfather. He came back to Vimy. He'd been here obviously in 1918 when he was wounded, and he came back to give a final statement, I guess, or final visit to the people who he had left behind. For him, it was a very, very big issue, and after he died, we found in his drawers every piece of paper from the Vimy pilgrimage, his special Vimy pilgrimage passport. He had the London Underground schedule for 1935, and he was a clerk in Bell Canada, so at that time he wasn't making much money. So to save up that much money during the Great Depression and to make this trip just shows how important this monument was to those Canadians.
We raise this memorial to Canadian warriors. This is the inspired expression in stone, chiseled by a skillful Canadian hand, of Canada's salute to her fallen sons. In that spirit, I unveil this memorial to Canada's dead.
The Vimy Memorial is Canada's national memorial, but it is also in a special sense the memorial for the 11,285 Canadian soldiers who died in France and whose bodies were never found. One of those vanished soldiers was William Crossland. Will had left his young wife and son at home in Winnipeg, and at the Battle of Courcelette, Will Crossland was one of the first Canadians to go over the top.
Your grandfather was missing in action at Courcelette on September the 15th, 1916. Right. And like most men who were missing, their bodies were never found, and they're commemorated here at Vimy. This is the memorial to the missing.
My grandmother was also given this. I don't know what it is, so maybe you can tell me a bit about what that's all about.
This is called the Next of Kin Memorial Plaque, or was known as the Dead Man's Penny. It was sent to families after the war, 1922, around there. Every family who lost somebody, they would get one of these plaques. And the plaques are unique in that they bear the name of the man who died. So this is an individual commemoration of this particular individual, which is William Crossland. So this is unique to your grandfather.
What do each of the things mean on here, Norm?
Well, you have the figure of Britannia, the British lion for the Empire, the dolphin signifying life. You have the British lion down here killing the German eagle, and he died for freedom and honor, and then with his name here. Well, because your grandfather was missing in action and his body was never found, and he died in France, he's commemorated here at Vimy. So his name is engraved on the wall around the bastion. And we'll just go and try to find it right now.
Yeah, there he is, look. W. William Crossland. So that's all that's left of my grandfather, right? No grave?
No grave. They never found his grave, and that's pretty common for First World War, unfortunately. 1 in 3 has no known grave.
In 1936 at Vimy, most Canadian veterans were able to pay their last respects to their dead comrades and come to terms with their past. But some demons of the Great War are not so easily laid to rest. Only 4 years after the Vimy Memorial is unveiled, another Great War veteran pays it a visit, former German Army Corporal Adolf Hitler. Under Hitler's leadership, Germany once again, as in 1914, invades Belgium and France. And once again, Canadian civilians line up with wooden rifles and set about learning how to be soldiers. And once again, a great flotilla takes them to Europe to fight. By 1944, the Second World War is raging, and Canon Frederick Scott, who survived the First War and feared the coming of the Second, dies and is buried in Montreal on a cold, bitter January day.
My comrades, where is the world we fought to establish? Where are those high principles which drew us, a mighty host, into the furnace of a war, to end all war?
And 6 months later, in June 1944, Canadian troops land with their allies on the beaches of Normandy. It is the first step back to the old battlefields where their fathers had fought in the Great War in Flanders. Once again, as in 1914, Canadian troops helped liberate Europe. Hitler's Germany will fall, and with it, one unfinished chapter of the Great War will finally be closed.
We're in Benny-sur-Mer Canadian War Cemetery in Normandy, and we're really looking at one of the legacies of the First World War, one of the saddest legacies of the First World War. For many of the men who survived, their sons would have to come and fight again, here in Normandy and through Europe, Italy, in the air over Germany, and many of them would die. And I think one of the saddest things is that they had to give up their sons. They scraped through themselves, and then to have another generation go off and die in rapid succession like this with such catastrophic results must have just been horrific for those men. This is the grave of Captain Stephen Bird, the North Nova Scotia Highlanders, killed 8th July 1944, aged 24. The personal inscription reads, "He lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and was loved. His memory remains." You can tell by reading that it was written by a World War I veteran, and his father was Will Bird.
Thy years pass, thy memory remains. Now thousands more are in graves, dead while they should yet be young. Thy years pass, thy memory remains.
Cabaret Rouge Cemetery in northern France, near Vimy Ridge. Just one of more than 2,000 First World War cemeteries and monuments strung along the old Western Front. During the 1920s and the 1930s, grieving relatives and friends came and remembered. The cafe at Cabaret Rouge was always full, but today the cafe's gone. Almost no one comes here anymore, except perhaps the occasional passerby.
I started coming across these cemeteries, these immaculate cemeteries, and I was curious as to who these people were. And I started to come across a lot of Canadian graves, fellows killed on the same day, and they were absolutely amazing in the way they preserve the history. They're frozen history, and that's what I found completely fascinating about them.
Halfway across, the first wave seemed to melt, and we were in front, headed for Fritz, who was firing wildly and strong. And as the remnants of us were nearing bombing reach, we almost as one dropped into the shell holes. Not a man was moving in no man's land, save the wounded, twisting and groaning in their agony.
The men who came here in 1914, 1915 were British. The men who attacked Vimy Ridge and captured Vimy Ridge were Canadians. And that transition took place in the hearts and souls of the men that were part of the Canadian Corps. And it was their ability, their pride in being members of the Canadian Corps that really created this whole concept of nationalism.
An officer came down and told us that the Germans were in the wood, which we could see before us at some distance in the moonlight. I passed down the line and told them, "It's a great day for Canada, boys." These words afterwards became a watchword, for the men said that whenever I told them that, it meant that half of them were going to be killed.